Welcome to Historiqon, a place where history is not just remembered, but questioned. Where the past is not silent, but speaks in long shadows. Tonight we travel back more than 2,000 years to ancient Athens. To a courtroom filled with noise, fear, and judgment. Where a 70-year-old philosopher named Socrates stands accused for asking questions. And among the crowd sits a young aristocrat named Plato, watching the wisest man he has ever known condemned to death by the very democracy he loved. A moment that would fracture his world forever and give birth to a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A question that would shape philosophy, politics, and human thought for millennia to come. What is justice? It is the spring of 399 BC. And in a crowded Athenian courtroom thick with heat, dust, and restless voices, 500 citizens sit shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, summoned by law to judge one old man's fate. Socrates is 70 years old, barefoot, calm and unafraid, standing before the democracy he has spent his entire life questioning. The charges against him are impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. Accusations that sound religious and moral on the surface, but conceal something far deeper and far more dangerous. The crime of asking questions in a city desperate for certainty. Among the jurors and spectators sits a young aristocrat named Plato, watching silently as the wisest man he has ever known is treated not as a teacher, but as a threat. Athens itself is wounded. Only a few years earlier, it had lost the Peloponnesian War in humiliating defeat. Its empire shattered, its navy destroyed. Its long walls torn down to the music of Spartan flutes. Democracy had collapsed into tyranny and then returned again, leaving the city paranoid, divided, and hungry for someone to blame. Socrates becomes that target, his accusers Meletus. Anytus and Lycon paint him as a corrupter of morals, a man who teaches young Athenians to mock their fathers, disrespect tradition, and doubt the gods. Yet the evidence is thin, built more on resentment than fact. Socrates has humiliated powerful men for decades by exposing their ignorance in public. Generals, politicians, poets, and craftsmen alike. And now those long-nurtured grudges converge in this courtroom. By Athenian custom, Socrates could save himself. He could beg, weep, bring his children forward to soften the jury's hearts. Many before him had done exactly that and lived. But Socrates refuses. Instead, he speaks calmly, playfully even, questioning his accusers as he always has, dismantling their claims through reason rather than emotion. He tells the jury that far from deserving punishment, he deserves reward. That he should be fed at public expense in the Prytaneum like an Olympic champion, because he has spent his life serving Athens by waking it from intellectual sleep. Calling himself a gadfly sent to sting the lazy horse of the state into awareness. The jurors do not laugh, they grow angrier, hands are raised. The first vote is close, but decisive, guilty. 280 votes against 220. And now comes the penalty phase. Socrates is asked to propose an alternative to death. A moment where submission could still save him. But again, he refuses to flatter or surrender. Offering only a small fine, the contempt in the room hardens. The second vote is wider, harsher. 360 jurors now choose death. More men vote to execute him after hearing his defiance than voted to convict him in the first place. Socrates accepts the sentence without bitterness, telling the court that no evil can come to a good man either in life or after death, declaring that the unexamined life is not worth living. And as guards lead him away to await execution by hemlock, Plato sits frozen, watching the city he loves condemn the best man he knows in the name of law. For Plato, this moment is not simply tragic, it is shattering. If Athens can kill Socrates and call it justice, then justice itself must be something other than law, something other than majority rule, something deeper and more elusive. And in that courtroom, as his teacher walks toward death with calm dignity, a question is born inside Plato that will dominate his life. drive him into exile, push him to travel the Mediterranean, compel him to found a school, and shape human thought for more than 2,000 years. A question as simple and as devastating as it is eternal: what is justice? To understand why this moment cut so deeply into Plato's soul, we must step backward into the world that shaped him long before he ever sat in that courtroom. Plato was born Aristocles around 428 or 427 BC in Athens, a city at the height of its cultural power, yet already standing on the edge of catastrophe. The name Plato came later, a nickname whose origins remain uncertain. Some said it referred to his broad shoulders earned through wrestling, others to his broad forehead, a sign of intellect. But whatever its source, the name replaced his birth name entirely, and Aristocles vanished into history. His family background placed him at the very center of Athenian life. On his father's side, Ariston claimed descent from Cadrus, the legendary last king of Athens, linking Plato to a lineage that blurred the line between history and myth. On his mother's side, Pericton traced her ancestry to Solon, the great lawgiver whose reforms had reshaped Athens 2 centuries earlier and laid the foundations of democracy itself. This was not simply aristocracy, but the ruling elite of the city, families who believed leadership was their birthright. Plato grew up surrounded by wealth, education, and expectation, in a household where political service was assumed rather than debated. His childhood unfolded beneath the shadow of the Parthenon, that gleaming temple to Athena crowning the Acropolis, a symbol of Athenian confidence, power, and divine favor. Yet the Athens Plato inherited was not the triumphant empire of Pericles' golden age. By the time Plato could form memories, the Peloponnesian War had already begun, a brutal struggle between Athens and Sparta that would dominate Greek life for nearly 30 years, shaping every conversation, every political decision, and every childhood memory. Plato's earliest years were marked by war, by the long funeral processions through the Ceramicus where the city honored its dead, by the fear each summer when Spartan armies marched into Attica, burning farms and driving rural families behind Athens' long walls, crowding the city into disease and desperation. When Plato was still a child, disaster struck. A plague swept through Athens in 430 BC, killing perhaps a quarter of the population, including Pericles himself, the leader who had embodied Athenian confidence and restraint. Thucydides, who survived the plague, described bodies stacked in streets, law and custom abandoned, faith in the gods shaken. This was the atmosphere in which Plato's mind began to form. Despite the chaos, his education followed the traditional aristocratic path. He trained in gymnastics to discipline the body, wrestling and running to cultivate strength and endurance. He studied music not as entertainment, but as moral training, learning the lyre and the mathematical ratios that governed harmony. He memorized Homer, absorbing the values, heroes and myths that defined Greek identity. And he was introduced to mathematics, especially geometry, which the Greeks believed revealed eternal truths beneath the disorder of the visible world. This education was designed to produce a leader, a man capable of speaking persuasively in the assembly, commanding troops in war and governing wisely in peace. Everything in Plato's upbringing pointed toward a life in politics. His family expected it, his city demanded it. Yet as Plato entered adolescence, the war revealed the darker side of democracy. Athens was no longer guided by careful statesmen, but by demagogues, skilled speakers who appealed to emotion rather than reason. The most catastrophic example came in 415 BC, when Plato was about 13 years old. The Athenian assembly voted to launch the Sicilian expedition, an ambitious plan to conquer Syracuse and dominate the Western Mediterranean. Whipped into enthusiasm by promises of glory and wealth, the people approved, sending the largest fleet Athens had ever assembled. The expedition ended in absolute disaster. By 413 BC, the entire force was destroyed, ships sunk, soldiers killed or enslaved. survivors left to die in the stone quarries of Syracuse. Athens never recovered, its treasury emptied, its confidence shattered, and Plato watched as the same democratic assembly that had voted for the expedition later turned on its generals, executing or exiling them to satisfy public rage. For a young aristocrat raised to believe in rational leadership, this chaos was deeply unsettling. It revealed how easily the crowd could be manipulated, how quickly public opinion could swing from confidence to panic, from admiration to blame. These experiences planted the seeds of Plato's lifelong suspicion of democracy, the belief that rule by the uneducated many was unstable and dangerous, that without wisdom and restraint, freedom could collapse into self-destruction. Long before he met Socrates, Plato was already witnessing the city tearing itself apart, and the ideals he had inherited were beginning to fracture under the weight of history. As Athens staggered under the weight of military defeat and political confusion, the city's internal tensions deepened, and Plato, now entering his late teens, watched democracy reveal its most volatile and destructive tendencies. The years following the Sicilian disaster were marked by fear, betrayal, and radical shifts in power. Demagogues rose and fell with alarming speed, promising salvation one moment and scapegoats the next. The assembly that claimed to represent the people increasingly acted from anger rather than judgment, executing generals, reversing decisions overnight, and eroding any sense of stable law. Figures like Alcibiades embodied this instability. Brilliant, charismatic, and utterly without scruple, Alcibiades could sway the crowd with ease, pushing Athens toward reckless ambition, and then, when accused of sacrilege, defecting first to Sparta and later to Persia, betraying his city repeatedly while remaining a symbol of its seductive but dangerous freedom. To Plato, Alcibiades was democracy made flesh, gifted, persuasive, and catastrophically unmoored from moral restraint. As the war dragged on, Athens grew desperate. Food shortages worsened, morale collapsed, and trust between citizens eroded. In 411 BC, an oligarchic coup briefly overthrew the democracy, replacing it with the rule of the 400, an elite faction that promised stability but delivered repression and violence. Though the democracy was restored within months, the damage was done. The idea that the people's rule was sacred and untouchable had been broken. Plato's own family was deeply entangled in these events. Several relatives believed democracy itself was the root of Athens' suffering. Among them was Critias, Plato's mother's cousin, a brilliant, ruthless man who had once associated with Socrates and now became one of the most extreme critics of popular rule. In 404 BC, Athens finally collapsed. Sparta cut off its grain supply. The city surrendered. Its walls were torn down in humiliation, and the victors installed a puppet regime. The 30 tyrants, drawn largely from Athenian aristocracy, Critias emerged as their most violent leader. What followed was a reign of terror. The 30 ruled through fear, executing opponents without trial, confiscating property, and murdering wealthy citizens to fund their regime. Within 8 months, nearly 1,500 Athenians were killed. Law ceased to exist, denunciations became a weapon, and survival often depended on silence or collaboration. Plato, barely in his 20s, watched his own class commit atrocities in the name of order and good government. Any lingering belief that aristocracy naturally produced virtue was shattered. The contrast between ideals and reality could not have been sharper. While Plato's relatives wielded power through cruelty, one strange figure remained unchanged. Socrates continued to walk the streets, questioning, refusing to flatter or submit. And when the 30 ordered him and others to arrest Leon of Salamis so he could be executed and his property seized, Socrates alone refused, simply going home rather than participating in injustice. The other men obeyed, and Leon was killed. Socrates' refusal placed his life at risk, yet he would not compromise. For Plato, this act burned itself into memory. The philosopher who claimed to know nothing proved to be the only man with true moral certainty. Tyranny fell in 403 BC when democratic exiles returned under Thrasybulus and defeated the 30. Critias was killed in battle, the democracy was restored, and an amnesty declared. But Athens emerged traumatized and vengeful. The city was now suspicious of anyone associated with oligarchy or critical thought. And Socrates, who had taught men on both sides of the conflict, became an obvious target. It was around this time, amid political collapse and moral confusion, that Plato truly encountered Socrates, not merely as a curious youth, but as a devoted student, drawn to a man who seemed immune to power, wealth, and fear. Socrates was unlike any teacher Athens had known. He charged no fees, claimed no expertise, and lived in poverty. Yet young men from the best families flocked to him, including Plato, Alcibiades, Critias, and Charmides. Socrates did not lecture, he questioned, using a relentless method of inquiry that exposed contradictions beneath confident claims. He would ask what courage was, what justice was, what virtue was, and by patiently following answers to their logical conclusions, he would leave his interlocutors confused and unsettled. This method, later called the elenchus, was devastating. It humiliated politicians and generals in public, revealing that those who claimed wisdom often possessed only opinion. For Plato, this was a revelation. Here was a man who sought truth rather than victory, who valued the health of the soul over reputation. Socrates taught that the wisest person is the one who knows that he knows nothing, that virtue is knowledge, and that an unexamined life is not worth living. In a city driven by ambition, fear, and rhetoric, these ideas were profoundly dangerous, and Plato, watching democracy collapse into tyranny and tyranny collapse back into democracy, began to see Socrates not just as a teacher, but as a living answer to the chaos around him. A man who embodied a different kind of authority, one rooted not in power or numbers, but in reason, integrity, and care for the soul. And it was this man, formed by decades of questioning and moral resistance, who would soon be brought before the same democracy Plato had watched fail so many times before, setting the stage for the event that would define Plato's entire philosophical life. Socrates' presence in Athens was both magnetic and corrosive, drawing young men toward him while steadily eroding the authority of the city's most respected figures. He was impossible to ignore, short, broad, barefoot, even in winter, wearing the same worn cloak year after year, poor by choice and indifferent to comfort. Yet wherever he went, conversation stopped and circles formed. Unlike the sophists who dominated Athenian intellectual life and charged high fees to teach rhetoric, the art of persuasion, Socrates claimed to teach nothing at all. He took no money, held no school, and wrote nothing. Instead, he questioned anyone willing to speak with him. Politicians, generals, poets, craftsmen, exposing the fragile foundations beneath their confidence. A general might claim to understand courage, only to be led through questions into admitting he could not define it. A poet might speak of beauty or virtue, only to discover he did not understand his own words. The sophist promised success, victory in court, influence in the assembly. But Socrates promised only discomfort, the painful realization that one's beliefs might be false. This was why young men like Plato were drawn to him. Socrates did not offer them power, he offered them honesty. He taught that reputation without knowledge was empty, that wealth without virtue corrupted the soul, that caring for one's character mattered more than pleasing the crowd. But this method had consequences. Every public humiliation created an enemy. Every exposed contradiction wounded pride. In a culture built on honor and status, Socrates' questions were a form of violence. He made powerful men look foolish in front of their peers. And over decades, resentment accumulated quietly. Meanwhile, the youth of Athens followed him, not because he instructed them to rebel, but because he freed them from inherited assumptions. Young aristocrats laughed at their elders' certainty, questioned tradition, and challenged authority. To anxious parents and politicians, this looked like corruption. Socrates' association with men who later became tyrants, Alcibiades, Critias, Charmides, deepened suspicion. Even though Socrates himself rejected their actions, Athens did not separate ideas from outcomes. When democracy returned after the Terror of the 30, it sought stability above all else. The amnesty forbade revenge, but it did not erase fear. And Socrates embodied everything unsettling. He questioned democracy, mocked public figures, and attracted the youth. In a city desperate to prevent another collapse, this was intolerable. The formal charges against him were carefully chosen: impiety toward the gods of the city and corruption of the youth, vague enough to mean anything and everything. Meletus, a young poet of little distinction, acted as the main accuser, but behind him stood Anytus, a powerful democratic politician who had suffered under the 30 and represented the craftsmen and common citizens. And Lycon, speaking for the professional rhetoricians Socrates had humiliated for years. Each group had its grievance. The poets resented ridicule. The politicians feared destabilization. The rhetoricians feared exposure. Together they framed Socrates not as a philosopher, but as a threat to public order. When the trial began in 399 BC, the setting itself revealed the nature of Athenian justice. There were no judges in the modern sense, no trained legal experts weighing evidence. Instead, 500 citizens chosen by lot listened to speeches and voted directly. Emotion mattered as much as argument. Tradition favored dramatic displays of humility, tears, appeals to family. But Socrates refused all of it. His defense, later recorded by Plato in the Apology, was not designed to save his life. It was designed to speak the truth as he saw it. He questioned Meletus publicly, exposing the incoherence of the charge that he both believed in no gods and introduced new divine beings. He argued that no one intentionally corrupts the youth, since corruption harms the city and therefore oneself. And he declared that his questioning was a divine mission, confirmed by the oracle at Delphi, which had declared him the wisest man in Athens, a statement Socrates interpreted not as praise but as irony. His wisdom lay in knowing his ignorance. He told the jury that killing him would not bring peace. It would only remove a voice that challenged them to care for virtue rather than wealth or power. But this honesty hardened opposition. Many jurors felt insulted rather than persuaded. When the first vote declared him guilty by a narrow margin, the moment of compromise arrived. Under Athenian law, Socrates could propose an alternative penalty: exile, a heavy fine, anything that acknowledged guilt and allowed the jury to save face. But Socrates refused to play along. He would not admit wrongdoing. He would not pretend regret. Instead, he suggested he deserved free meals at the Prytaneum, the city's highest honor, a reward for service. This was not arrogance but consistency, yet to the jury it sounded like mockery. The second vote was decisive: death by hemlock. And in that instant, Athens crossed a line it could never uncross, executing a 70-year-old man for asking questions. Socrates did not rage or beg. He accepted the verdict calmly, telling the jurors that death might be a blessing, either a dreamless sleep or a journey to converse with great minds of the past. For Plato, watching this unfold, the lesson was unbearable. Democracy, when driven by fear and wounded pride, could destroy its own conscience. The city that claimed to value freedom had silenced the freest man it had ever produced. And as Socrates was led away in chains to await execution, Plato began to understand that philosophy was not merely an intellectual pursuit, it was a dangerous one, capable of colliding with power, law, and mass opinion. And that collision would shape the rest of his life. After the verdict was delivered and Socrates was led away, Athens did not immediately carry out the execution. A sacred mission to Delos honoring Apollo had already departed. and by law no executions could take place until the ship returned, granting Socrates a final month of life. A strange and suspended time in which philosophy and death walked side by side. Socrates was confined to a small prison cell. His body chained, but his mind entirely free. Friends and students were allowed to visit, among them Crito, Phaedo, and others who had followed him for years. They came grieving, angry, and desperate to save him. And together, they devised a plan for escape. Bribes were arranged, guards could be bought. Safe passage out of Athens was secured. Exile was possible, survival was within reach. Yet Socrates refused, not out of resignation, but out of principle. In the dialogue later written by Plato, entitled Crito, Socrates explains his reasoning with devastating clarity. To escape would be to commit injustice. He argues that he has lived his entire life under the laws of Athens, benefiting from them, raising his children under their protection, enjoying the freedom to question and teach. If he breaks those laws now simply because they condemn him unjustly, he would be acting on the belief that justice is whatever serves one's own interest. He would be destroying the very idea of law itself. Socrates personifies the laws, imagining them asking whether he intends to repay upbringing and protection with betrayal, whether he believes agreements matter only when convenient. He insists that one must never commit injustice, even in response to injustice. Even to save one's own life, Crito weeps. But Socrates remains unmoved. Philosophy has taught him that the health of the soul matters more than survival. When the day finally arrives, Phaedo later records the scene in painful detail. Socrates spends his final hours discussing the immortality of the soul, not as a comfort, but as a serious philosophical inquiry. He argues that the philosopher practices death throughout life, separating the soul from bodily desires, training it to care for truth rather than pleasure. Death, for such a soul, is not catastrophe but release. The jailer enters with the cup of hemlock. Ashamed and emotional, Socrates takes it calmly, asking only if he may pour a libation to the gods. There is only enough poison for the fatal dose, so he drinks it in one motion, walks until his legs grow heavy, lies down as instructed. The numbness climbs upward through his body, and with his final breath, he utters words that would puzzle philosophers for centuries, telling Crito that they owe a rooster to Asclepius, the god of healing, as if death itself were a cure. Plato was not present. Later accounts say he was ill. Whether from sickness or from grief too heavy to bear, no one knows. But the impact of that death on him was immediate and overwhelming. Association with Socrates was now dangerous. The democracy had demonstrated its willingness to silence dissent permanently. Plato's family background, already tainted by the crimes of the 30, made remaining in Athens risky, and so Plato left. First for Megara, where Euclid, another devoted follower of Socrates, offered refuge. There a small group of exiled students gathered, trying to understand how a city could kill its conscience and call it lawful. But Plato could not remain still. Grief turned into restlessness, and restlessness into a search. Over the next decade, he traveled widely across the Greek world, seeking knowledge that could not be destroyed by juries or mobs. Ancient sources speak of journeys to Cyrene in North Africa, where he studied mathematics with Theodorus, whose work on irrational numbers deepened Plato's conviction that mathematical truth exists beyond the physical world. Some claim he traveled to Egypt to learn from priests and ancient traditions. Though modern scholars doubt this, yet the story itself reveals something true. Plato was searching beyond Athens for wisdom older and more stable than politics. What is certain is his journey to southern Italy, where he encountered the Pythagoreans, a community devoted to mathematics, harmony, and the purification of the soul. They believed that numbers were the foundation of reality, that musical beauty reflected numerical ratios, that the cosmos itself was structured mathematically, and that the soul was immortal. trapped temporarily in the body and destined for rebirth until purified through philosophy. For Plato, shattered by the execution of Socrates. This vision was transformative. Here was a world where justice did not depend on courts, where truth was eternal and untouched by violence, where the soul mattered more than the state. Among the Pythagoreans he met Archytas of Tarentum, a rare figure who embodied what Plato had begun to imagine. A philosopher who was also a successful statesman, respected, just, and rational. Proof that wisdom and power might yet be reconciled. It was in this intellectual atmosphere that the seeds of Plato's most famous ideas were planted. The belief in a higher realm of eternal forms, perfect and unchanging, of which the physical world is only an imperfect reflection. Justice, beauty, and goodness, Plato began to think, must exist beyond human institutions. Because human institutions fail, Athens had proven that. The death of Socrates was no longer just a tragedy, it became evidence. Evidence that truth and power are not naturally aligned, that the many can destroy the good, and that philosophy must find a way to protect itself from politics, or perhaps transform politics from within. This tension between withdrawal and engagement, between contemplation and action, would define Plato's life, drive him back toward danger in Sicily, and ultimately lead him to found an institution unlike anything the world had seen before. A school dedicated not to persuasion or power, but to the lifelong pursuit of truth. Plato's search for a stable foundation of truth eventually drew him toward the western edge of the Greek world, to Sicily, a land rich in power, ambition, and danger, and to the city of Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city in the West, ruled for decades by Dionysius I, a tyrant whose authority rested not on law but on force. Dionysius had transformed Syracuse into a military powerhouse, surrounding himself with mercenaries, fortifications, and spies. His court glittered with luxury, poets, musicians, and philosophers were welcomed. But beneath the surface lay paranoia and brutality. Dionysius trusted no one, slept in different rooms each night, executed perceived enemies without hesitation, and ruled through fear. Plato arrived in Syracuse around 388 or 387 BC, likely drawn by intellectual curiosity and by connections formed through the Pythagorean network. But once there he encountered Dion, the tyrant's brother-in-law, a young aristocrat of intelligence and seriousness. Dissatisfied with the moral emptiness of court life, Dion was captivated by Plato's vision of philosophy as the care of the soul and the foundation of just rule. And Plato, in turn, saw in Dion a rare possibility, a man close to power who might genuinely be shaped by wisdom. Encouraged by this connection, Plato began speaking openly at court about justice, virtue, and the nature of true rulership. He argued that tyrants, despite their absolute power, were not truly free, enslaved as they were to fear, suspicion, and endless desire. True freedom, Plato claimed, belonged only to those who governed themselves through reason. And only a ruler guided by philosophy could be just and happy. These ideas did not flatter Dionysius, whether through arrogance, naivety, or moral courage. Plato failed to soften his message. Ancient accounts differ on the details, but the outcome is clear. Dionysius grew hostile, seeing Plato not as a teacher but as a threat, a man who undermined his authority by exposing its moral emptiness. Eventually Dionysius arranged for Plato's removal, handing him over to a Spartan ambassador named Polis, who was returning home by sea when the ship stopped at the island of Aegina. An enemy of Athens, Polis sold Plato into slavery, a deliberate act of humiliation meant to erase the philosopher's dignity. Plato, a man of aristocratic birth and immense intellect, now faced a future as property, stripped of freedom and identity. His fate could have ended there, but chance intervened. A philosopher named Anaxagoras of Cyrene recognized him and paid the ransom for his release, freeing Plato and sending him back to Greece. Shaken but alive, this experience marked him deeply. Philosophy had confronted raw power and lost. Reason had no protection against tyranny. And Plato returned to Athens with a bitter clarity. Persuasion alone could not tame those who ruled by force. Wisdom without institutional support was vulnerable. Yet Plato did not abandon philosophy, instead he transformed it. In 387 B.C. he purchased land in a sacred grove just outside the walls of Athens. Named after the hero Academus, and there he founded the academy. Not a temporary circle around a single teacher, but a permanent institution devoted to learning. It was unlike anything the Greek world had seen. Students did not come to learn rhetoric for political success, but to pursue truth for its own sake. Mathematics formed the foundation of study. Geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and harmonics. Disciplines that trained the mind to grasp eternal and unchanging realities. Only after years of mathematical training would students advance to dialectic, the refined practice of questioning that Socrates had pioneered, but now systematized and disciplined. Philosophy at the academy was not dogma, but practice. Dialogue, argument, reflection, a way of life rather than a profession. Women were admitted alongside men, a radical departure from Athenian norms. And learning was pursued communally, as a shared ascent toward understanding. In founding the academy, Plato created a refuge for philosophy, a space protected from the volatility of politics, where questions could be asked without fear of execution or exile. Yet even as he built this sanctuary, the tension between philosophy and power remained unresolved within him. The dream of the philosopher king, of wisdom guiding rule, had not died. It had merely retreated, waiting for another opportunity. And that opportunity, dangerously and tragically, would arise once again in Syracuse, pulling the aging philosopher back into the orbit of tyranny and testing his beliefs more severely than ever before. Years passed at the academy, and Plato, now entering middle age, devoted himself to teaching, writing and refining the philosophical vision that had begun with Socrates' questions and hardened through political failure. It was during this period that he composed many of his most influential dialogues, works that did not present philosophy as doctrine but as living conversation, placing Socrates at the center as a voice that probed, challenged and refused easy conclusions. Dialogues like the Apology, Crito and Phaedo preserved the memory of Socrates' trial and death, while others such as the Meno explored the nature of learning itself, suggesting that knowledge is not acquired from the senses, but recollected by the soul from a prior existence, an idea that reflected Plato's growing belief in the soul's immortality and its connection to eternal truth. The symposium examined love not as mere desire, but as a ladder of ascent, beginning with physical attraction and rising toward the contemplation of beauty itself. A vision that transformed eros into a force driving the soul toward the eternal. Yet Plato's most ambitious work emerged during these years, the Republic, a dialogue that confronted directly the question that had haunted him since 399 BC. What is justice? Socrates proposes answering this by constructing an ideal city in speech, reasoning that justice in the soul would be easier to see if magnified in the structure of a state. The resulting vision was radical and unsettling. The city is divided into classes corresponding to parts of the soul, producers governed by appetite, auxiliaries by spirit, and guardians by reason. Justice is harmony, each part doing its proper work without interfering with the others. But to preserve this harmony, Plato proposed measures that shocked even his contemporaries. The guardian class would own no private property, live communally, and even share families. Children raised by the state to prevent loyalty to blood over loyalty to justice. Women would be educated alongside men and could rule if they possessed the necessary ability. Gender, Plato argued, was irrelevant to virtue. Above all stood the philosopher kings, rulers who had ascended beyond opinion to knowledge of the forms. eternal realities that exist beyond the physical world. Plato illustrated this ascent through the allegory of the cave, in which prisoners mistake shadows for reality until one is freed and sees the sun, the source of all truth and being. This sun represents the form of the good, the highest reality, illuminating all others. Only those who have seen it are fit to rule, not because they desire power, but because justice demands they return to the cave to govern for the good of all. The Republic was not merely a political blueprint, it was a response to Athens' failure, an attempt to imagine a city that could not execute its wisest citizen. Yet even as Plato wrote these ideals, experience was preparing to challenge them. In 367 BC, news arrived from Syracuse. Dionysius I was dead after nearly 4 decades of tyranny. His son Dionysius II had inherited the throne. Young, insecure, and untested, Dion, Plato's former student and devoted ally, saw in this moment a unique opportunity. He believed the new ruler could be shaped before corruption hardened him. Letters were sent urging Plato to return to Sicily and educate the young tyrant, to turn theory into reality, to finally create a philosopher king. Plato was 60 years old, cautious and painfully aware of past failure. Yet the appeal struck at the core of his convictions. If philosophy could not influence power when the chance arose, then what was its purpose? After long hesitation and against the advice of his students, Plato agreed, leaving the academy under the care of others, including a brilliant young Macedonian student named Aristotle, and sailed once more towards Syracuse. Initially, the signs were hopeful. Dionysius II welcomed Plato with honors. Philosophy became fashionable at court. Diagrams were drawn on floors. Conversations turned to virtue and mathematics. And for a brief moment, it appeared that reason might guide power, but the illusion quickly dissolved. Dionysius admired philosophy as an ornament, not as discipline. He enjoyed the prestige of Plato's presence, but resented the moral demands philosophy imposed. Dion's influence at court, grounded in integrity and popular support, made him a threat. Whispers spread accusing him of plotting against the tyrant. And Dionysius, torn between admiration and fear, chose control. Dion was exiled, his property confiscated, and Plato found himself trapped. A guest who could not leave, a teacher without authority. Held in polite captivity, months passed, promises were made and broken. And eventually Plato was allowed to return to Athens. Disillusioned and furious, the experiment had failed. Philosophy could inspire admiration, but not obedience. Power without virtue could not be educated. Yet even this failure did not end the tragedy. Dion, still devoted to Plato's ideals, continued to believe Syracuse could be saved. And his fate would soon force Plato to confront the limits of philosophy in the harshest possible way. A lesson written not in dialogue but in blood. As the dream of the philosopher king collapsed once more under the weight of ambition, fear and betrayal, Plato returned to Athens shaken and bitter. But the story of Syracuse refused to release him. In 361 BC, another summons arrived. Dionysius II sent a ship carrying renewed promises, pledging reconciliation with Dion, restoration of his property, and a genuine commitment to philosophy. Dion himself wrote pleading letters, and influential friends like Archytas of Tarentum urged Plato to return, arguing that abandoning the effort would betray both friendship and principle. Plato was now 66 years old, deeply skeptical and painfully aware of the danger. Yet the pull of responsibility proved stronger than caution. If philosophy was to mean anything beyond private contemplation, he believed it had to be tested against power one final time. Against his students' protests, he sailed again to Sicily, only to find that the promises were illusions. Dionysius II had no intention of restoring Dion. Instead, he sought to use Plato as a symbol of legitimacy, a philosopher at court to impress allies and intimidate rivals. Plato's movements were restricted, his correspondence monitored, his property in Syracuse confiscated, and the atmosphere grew openly hostile. Mercenaries resented his presence, and rumors circulated of threats against his life. Philosophy had become a dangerous ornament in a court ruled by fear. Realizing the trap too late, Plato managed to send a secret message to Archytas requesting help. And through diplomatic pressure, Archytas secured his release, allowing the aging philosopher to escape Syracuse for the third and final time. Plato returned to Athens exhausted and resolved never to return. The dream of reforming tyranny from within was dead, but the tragedy deepened. Dion, still in exile and still convinced of Plato's ideals, gathered mercenaries and allies, and in 357 BC launched an invasion of Syracuse. Astonishingly, he succeeded. Dionysius II fled, and Dion entered the city as a liberator. For a brief moment, Plato's vision seemed possible. A student of philosophy holding power, promising moderation, law, and reform. Yet Syracuse was poisoned by decades of violence and distrust. Factions formed immediately. Democrats accused Dion of oligarchic ambition. Mercenaries demanded payment, and Dion himself, untrained in the brutal pragmatics of rule, became isolated and authoritarian. The ideals he had absorbed from Plato clashed with the chaos of reality. In 354 BC, Dion was assassinated by Callippus, a supposed friend and fellow student of Plato, a betrayal that shocked the Greek world. Syracuse collapsed into civil war and renewed tyranny. Plato, now in his 70s, received the news in Athens with profound grief. The death of Dion was not merely personal loss, it was philosophical catastrophe. The most sincere attempt to unite wisdom and power had ended in blood. Betrayed from within by ambition disguised as virtue. In the aftermath, Plato wrote the seventh letter, reflecting bitterly on his Sicilian failures, concluding that philosophy and politics are incompatible in corrupt states, that only when rulers genuinely love wisdom or philosophers gain power without being corrupted could justice emerge. Conditions he now believed were nearly impossible, turning away from political engagement. Plato devoted his remaining years to teaching and writing. His later dialogues grew darker and more technical. The laws abandoned the utopian vision of the Republic in favor of a second-best city, governed by detailed legal codes rather than philosopher kings. A city designed not for ideal souls, but for flawed human beings. Discipline replaced inspiration, order replaced vision. And in dialogues like Parmenides, Plato subjected his own theory of forms to merciless critique, exposing logical paradoxes without resolving them, as if acknowledging that even his most cherished ideas were incomplete. During these years, the Academy flourished as an institution independent of its founder. Students from across the Mediterranean gathered beneath the olive trees. Among them Aristotle, who challenged Plato relentlessly, grounding knowledge in observation rather than transcendent forms. Their debates became legendary, symbolizing two paths philosophy would follow for centuries. Rationalism and empiricism. As Plato aged, his role shifted from visionary to elder, less eager to persuade the world and more concerned with preserving a space where thought could survive unmolested by power. The Academy became his answer to Athens and Syracuse alike, a quiet resistance to tyranny and mob rule. A place where the examined life could continue without fear of hemlock or exile. And as his body weakened, Plato turned increasingly toward cosmic questions, composing the Timaeus, a mathematical creation myth describing a rational universe shaped by a divine craftsman according to eternal forms. And the Critias, the unfinished tale of Atlantis, a powerful civilization destroyed by its own corruption. An unmistakable warning drawn from history and experience. In his final years, Plato seemed less interested in saving cities than in understanding the structure of reality itself, as if acknowledging that justice might never fully exist in the human world, but could still be contemplated, pursued and approximated through reason, teaching and dialogue, and in that acceptance, tempered by failure and loss. Plato's philosophy reached its final form, not triumphant, but enduring. Not hopeful in politics, but resolute in thought, carrying forward the belief that even when power destroys wisdom, wisdom can outlive power. As Plato withdrew from direct political ambition and settled into the final phase of his life, his focus turned increasingly toward the deepest questions of reality, knowledge, and the soul. Questions that could not be answered by cities or laws, but only by philosophy itself. During these later years, he refined the theory that would become the most distinctive and controversial element of his thought. The theory of forms, a response to a problem that had troubled Greek thinkers for generations. If the physical world is constantly changing, as Heraclitus had argued, how can we have stable knowledge of anything at all? How can truth exist in a world where everything flows? Plato's answer was radical. Reality is divided into two realms: the visible world of becoming, accessed through the senses, and the invisible, intelligible world of being, accessed through reason. The physical world is populated by particular things: individual horses, trees, laws, and people, all imperfect, temporary and subject to decay. But behind these stand the forms, eternal, unchanging and perfect realities such as justice, beauty, equality, and goodness. Physical things are what they are only by participating in these forms. A just action is just because it participates in the form of justice. A beautiful object is beautiful because it reflects the form of beauty. The forms do not exist in space or time. They are not created or destroyed. They simply are, more real than anything the senses can perceive. Mathematics provided Plato with his clearest example. No one has ever seen a perfect circle in nature. Yet geometers prove eternal truths about circles that never change. These truths cannot come from the senses. They must belong to a higher realm of reality, and the human soul, Plato believed, has access to this realm because it once belonged to it. Learning, therefore, is not the acquisition of new information but recollection. Anamnesis, the soul remembering truths it knew before its embodiment. Plato dramatizes this in the Meno, where Socrates leads an uneducated slave boy to discover a complex geometric truth through questioning alone, suggesting that knowledge lies dormant within the soul, waiting to be awakened. This belief shaped Plato's entire vision of education. Teaching was not the transfer of facts, but the turning of the soul toward what it already knows. An idea famously expressed through the allegory of the cave, where education is described not as putting sight into blind eyes, but turning the whole body toward the light. At the summit of the intelligible realm stands the form of the good, the highest principle, source of all being and knowledge. Plato struggled to describe it, comparing it to the sun, which makes visibility and life possible without itself being sight. The good gives intelligibility and existence to the forms themselves, yet remains beyond full comprehension. This metaphysical vision was inseparable from Plato's ethics and psychology. The soul, he argued, is tripartite, composed of reason, spirit, and appetite. Reason seeks truth, spirit seeks honor and recognition, appetite seeks pleasure and satisfaction. Justice in the soul is harmony, reason ruling, spirit supporting reason, and appetite obeying. When appetite rules, the soul becomes disordered and miserable. And when reason governs, the soul achieves balance and happiness. This inner order mirrors the just city of the Republic. But Plato increasingly recognized that such harmony is fragile in human life, threatened constantly by desire, ambition, and fear. Death, however, offered a resolution. In the Phaedo, Plato presents Socrates' final reflections on the soul's immortality, arguing that the soul, being simple and akin to the forms, cannot be destroyed like composite physical objects. Philosophy, Socrates claims, is the practice of dying. a lifelong preparation for the separation of soul from body, freeing it from the distractions of sensation and desire. Myths of the afterlife, such as the myth of at the end of the Republic, illustrate this belief poetically, depicting souls judged after death, rewarded or punished, and then choosing new lives, most choosing poorly, seduced again by power and pleasure, while the truly wise choose modest, just lives, having learned that happiness lies not in domination but in balance. These myths were not meant as literal geography, but as moral vision, ways of impressing upon the imagination what reason grasps abstractly, that how we live shapes not only our character, but the destiny of the soul. Yet Plato was not blind to the difficulties of his own theory. In the dialogue Parmenides, he subjects the theory of forms to relentless critique, exposing paradoxes such as the third man argument, which suggests that if a form explains similarity among particulars, another form would be needed to explain the similarity between the form and the particulars. Leading to infinite regress, Plato offers no solution, leaving the dialogue unresolved, a rare moment of philosophical self-criticism that reveals a thinker still questioning even his most central ideas. Perhaps Plato recognized that philosophy is not the possession of truth, but the pursuit of it, a disciplined openness rather than a closed system. As his strength waned and his teaching continued, these late reflections took on a quieter tone. Less confident in politics, more cautious in metaphysics, yet no less committed to the belief that reality is intelligible, that the soul matters, and that reason, though limited, is humanity's highest faculty. In these final years, Plato was no longer trying to save cities. He was trying to understand the structure of existence itself, preparing not only his students but himself for the final transition, the passage from the world of becoming back toward the realm of being, where justice, beauty, and truth are not voted on, betrayed, or executed, but simply and eternally are. As Plato's thought matured and turned inward, his reflections on love, desire, and the soul's longing for immortality took on a central role, culminating in the dialogue known as the Symposium, a work that reveals perhaps the most intimate dimension of his philosophy. The dialogue is set at a drinking party in Athens, where guests take turns offering speeches in praise of Eros, the god of love, and each speaker captures a different aspect of human desire. Aristophanes presents a comic myth in which humans were once whole beings split apart by the gods, doomed to wander in search of their lost halves, suggesting that love is the yearning for completion, but it is Socrates' speech, recounting the teachings of the priestess Diotima, that carries Plato's deepest insight. Diotima teaches that love is not the possession of beauty, but the desire for it. And because desire is always for what one lacks, love is a force that drives the soul upward, seeking permanence in a world of decay. Eros is neither mortal nor divine, but a daimon, a mediator between human longing and eternal truth. Diotima describes love as an ascent, a ladder the soul climbs step by step, beginning with attraction to a single beautiful body, then recognizing beauty in all bodies, then turning toward the beauty of souls, valuing virtue over appearance, then ascending further to love beautiful laws, institutions, and forms of knowledge, and finally reaching the vision of beauty itself, the form of beauty, eternal, pure, and unchanging. This vision is not abstract coldness, but the fulfillment of desire itself, the moment when love is satisfied not by possession, but by understanding. This idea reshaped the meaning of love in Western thought, transforming eros from appetite into aspiration, not something to be suppressed, but refined and redirected toward truth. The symposium ends dramatically with Alcibiades bursting in drunk, delivering a passionate speech praising Socrates himself rather than Eros, describing how he tried and failed to seduce the philosopher, only to discover that Socrates was immune to bodily temptation, devoted entirely to the beauty of the soul. This portrait of Socrates, as both erotic and ascetic, embodies Plato's ideal. A human being who feels desire deeply, but refuses to be ruled by it, as Plato explored love. He also reflected increasingly on the soul's journey across lifetimes, influenced by Pythagorean and Orphic traditions. He believed the soul is immortal and undergoes cycles of rebirth, carrying the moral consequences of its actions from one life to the next. This belief gave cosmic weight to ethics. Injustice was not merely social failure but spiritual damage, a corruption that followed the soul beyond death. Philosophy thus became not only intellectual inquiry but purification, a way of aligning the soul with the order of reality itself. Yet Plato's personal life remained strangely quiet. He never married and left no known children, an unusual choice for an aristocrat of his standing. Ancient sources hint at close relationships with young men, which were culturally accepted in Athens. But Plato's writings suggest that physical intimacy was always subordinate to intellectual and spiritual connection. Love for him was meaningful only insofar as it pointed beyond itself, toward the eternal. As years passed and the academy continued to thrive, Plato witnessed a new generation challenge his ideas from within. Most notably Aristotle, who had arrived as a teenager and remained for 2 decades. Aristotle admired Plato deeply, but rejected the theory of forms, arguing that universals do not exist in a separate realm, but within particular things themselves. Knowledge, Aristotle claimed, begins with observation, not recollection. Their debates symbolized a philosophical divide that would shape the future of thought. Plato pointing upward toward transcendent realities, Aristotle grounding knowledge in the empirical world. Tradition later captured this contrast visually, imagining Plato gesturing toward the heavens and Aristotle toward the earth. Yet despite disagreement, their relationship was rooted in mutual respect. Plato reportedly called Aristotle the mind of the academy, even as he recognized the challenge he posed. As Plato entered his 70s, his writing grew more cautious and sober. In the Laws, he abandoned the vision of philosopher kings entirely, describing instead a second-best city governed by detailed laws and strict institutions, acknowledging that most humans would never achieve philosophical wisdom, and that stability often requires constraint rather than enlightenment. This shift reflects hard-earned realism, born from the failures of Athens and Syracuse alike. Yet even in this pessimism, Plato did not abandon hope altogether. He believed that education, discipline, and law could still orient human life toward the good, even if perfection remained out of reach. During these final years, Plato also delivered lectures on the good that baffled audiences, speaking not of ethics, but of numbers, unity, and multiplicity, hinting at unwritten doctrines known only to advanced students. Aristotle later reported that Plato's ultimate principles were the one and the indefinite dyad, metaphysical sources from which even the forms themselves derived, suggesting that Plato's thought continued to evolve beyond what he committed to writing, perhaps because he believed the highest truths could not be fixed in text, but only grasped through sustained dialogue. And so as his body weakened and his eyesight dimmed, Plato remained intellectually restless, still questioning, still refining, still teaching. The philosopher who had begun his journey watching injustice in a courtroom was now preparing to face death not as tragedy, but as transition, confident that the soul's work did not end with the body, and that the pursuit of truth, though never complete, was the highest and most enduring expression of human life. As Plato approached the final decade of his life, the academy had become more than a school. It was now a living tradition, an intellectual organism that no longer depended entirely on its founder. Students arrived from across the Greek world, from Asia Minor, southern Italy, and even the distant kingdom of Macedon, drawn by the reputation of a place where questions were taken seriously and where philosophy was practiced as a way of life rather than a profession. Plato's daily routine had settled into a quiet rhythm. Morning walks beneath the olive trees, discussions with students in shaded courtyards, and long evenings spent composing dialogues that reflected a mind tempered by experience. Loss and failure, the radical confidence of the Republic, had softened into a sober realism. And this shift is most clearly visible in his late works, especially the Laws, Plato's longest dialogue. Written when he was already an old man, unlike the Republic, it contains no Socrates, no dazzling dialectical reversals. Instead, it unfolds as a slow, careful conversation among aging thinkers, attempting to design a workable constitution for imperfect human beings. The city imagined in the Laws is not ruled by philosopher kings, but by law itself, detailed, exhaustive, and restrictive, covering everything from education and marriage to drinking parties and religious ritual. This was Plato acknowledging that most people would never ascend to the vision of the good, and that stability required structure, discipline, and external constraint, not enlightenment alone. Yet even here philosophy remains central. A nocturnal council of the most educated citizens was tasked with safeguarding the spirit of the Laws, ensuring that the city did not drift into corruption. This council represented Plato's final compromise between wisdom and power. Philosophy no longer ruling directly, but quietly guiding from the margins. During these years, Plato also reflected deeply on his own legacy, aware that his ideas were being interpreted, challenged, and reshaped by students like Aristotle, who increasingly rejected the separation of forms from the physical world. Aristotle argued that universals exist within things themselves, that knowledge begins with sense perception and is built upward through abstraction, a position that directly challenged Plato's belief in recollection and transcendent forms. These disagreements did not fracture the academy, but they signaled that Plato's philosophy was no longer a single voice. It had become a field of debate, a sign of intellectual vitality rather than decline. Aristotle's presence forced Plato to sharpen his thinking, and some scholars believe that dialogues like Parmenides and Sophist reflect Plato's attempt to address criticisms emerging from within his own school, refining the concept of being, non-being, and participation, probing the logical foundations of his metaphysics with unprecedented rigor. Far from resting on authority, Plato subjected himself to the same questioning he had inherited from Socrates, a testament to his commitment to philosophy as inquiry rather than doctrine. As his health declined, Plato became increasingly aware of mortality. But unlike Socrates, whose death was sudden and violent, Plato's aging was gradual, giving him time to reflect on the meaning of a life devoted to thought. He had outlived most of his contemporaries, witnessed the rise and fall of regimes, the deaths of students and friends, and the repeated failure of philosophy to reform power directly. Yet he did not conclude that philosophy was futile. Rather, he came to see it as a long game, working slowly through education rather than revolution, shaping souls rather than institutions. The academy embodied this conviction. It was a seed planted for the future, not a solution for the present. Plato also seems to have grown more reserved about myth and cosmic speculation, even as he continued to use them as pedagogical tools. In works like the Timaeus, he described the universe as a rational organism shaped by a divine craftsman, the demiurge who imposes mathematical order on chaos by looking to the eternal forms. But these myths were offered cautiously, not as literal cosmology but as likely stories, ways of aligning the imagination with reason when certainty was impossible. This humility marked a subtle but important change. Plato was no longer seeking final answers. He was modeling how to think responsibly in the absence of them. And as he neared the end of his life, his influence had already begun to spread beyond Athens. Former students carried his methods and ideas to other cities, founding schools, advising rulers, and writing treatises of their own. Philosophy was no longer confined to one man or one place. It had become a tradition capable of survival. And in this sense, Plato had succeeded where politics had failed. He could not create a just city, but he had created a community of inquiry that could endure across generations. When Plato finally died around 348 or 347 BC, at the age of 80 or 81, accounts differ on the details but agree on the nature of his passing. There was no drama, no trial, no poison. Some said he died peacefully in his sleep. Others that he passed away during a wedding feast, surrounded by music and celebration. A fitting end for the author of the Symposium. He was buried either in the Academy itself or in the Ceramicus, Athens' honored cemetery. And leadership of the school passed to his nephew Speusippus, not to Aristotle. Perhaps because Aristotle was a foreigner, or because his views had diverged too sharply. With Plato's death, an era ended, but his influence had only begun. The Academy would continue for nearly 1,000 years, outlasting empires and religions. And Plato's dialogues would become the foundation of Western philosophy, read, argued over and reinterpreted by generations who would never know the man, but would continue to wrestle with the questions he had made unavoidable. What is justice? What is real? And how should we live?
After Plato's death, the Academy did not dissolve into memory, but continued as a living institution, carrying forward his questions, even as his answers were revised, challenged, and sometimes abandoned. Speusippus, Plato's nephew, became the first successor, emphasizing mathematical and metaphysical aspects of Plato's thought, particularly ideas Plato had taught orally but never written down, doctrines concerning unity, multiplicity, and the numerical structure of reality. Under Speusippus and later Xenocrates, the Academy preserved a broadly Platonic vision, committed to the immortality of the soul, the reality of intelligible principles, and the central role of philosophy in shaping character. Yet Plato's legacy was never static. It evolved with each generation, reflecting the very spirit of inquiry he had championed. In the 3rd century BC, the Academy took a dramatic turn toward skepticism under Arcesilas, who argued that certainty is impossible and that Socrates' true wisdom lay in knowing that he did not know. This interpretation transformed the Academy into a school that trained its students to argue both sides of every question and to suspend judgment, a position later refined by Carneades, who introduced probabilism, the idea that while certainty cannot be achieved, some beliefs are more reasonable than others and can guide action. This skeptical phase shocked later Platonists, but remained faithful in its own way to the dialogical openness of Plato's writings, where final answers are often withheld. In the 1st century BC, Antiochus of Ascalon attempted a return to what he considered authentic Platonism, blending Plato's ideas with elements of Aristotle and Stoicism, creating a synthesis that would deeply influence Roman thinkers, among them Cicero, who studied at the Academy and translated Platonic philosophy into Latin concepts, carrying Plato into Roman political and ethical thought. Through Cicero, Plato became a moral authority in the Roman world, a guide to virtue, duty, and the examined life, even as the Academy itself eventually declined. Its physical presence in Athens lasted nearly a millennium, from 387 BC until 529 AD, when the Christian emperor Justinian ordered its closure as part of a broader suppression of pagan philosophy. Yet by then, Plato's influence had already escaped its walls, flowing into new traditions that would shape the spiritual and intellectual future of Europe and the Mediterranean. Most notably, Neoplatonism, a movement that emerged in the 3rd century AD with Plotinus, who reimagined Plato's ideas with mystical intensity. Plotinus taught that all reality flows from a single, ineffable source he called the One, beyond being, beyond thought, from which emanates the realm of intellect containing the forms, and from intellect the soul, which animates the physical world. The human soul, according to Plotinus, is caught between matter and intellect, and the purpose of life is ascent, a return journey upward through purification, contemplation, and virtue, culminating in mystical union with the One, an experience beyond language or concept. This vision transformed Plato's philosophy into a spiritual path, and through the writings of Porphyry and Proclus, Neoplatonism became the dominant philosophical system of late antiquity, influencing pagan, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thinkers alike. Early Christianity, initially suspicious of Greek philosophy, gradually absorbed Platonic concepts. The Gospel of John's use of the Logos echoed Greek philosophical language, and church fathers like Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria argued that Plato had glimpsed divine truth imperfectly, preparing the Greeks for Christian revelation. Augustine of Hippo would become the most important bridge between Plato and Christianity, reading Neoplatonic texts before his conversion and finding in them a vision of immaterial truth that freed him from materialism. For Augustine, the forms became ideas in the mind of God, the soul's ascent became a return to its creator, and the Platonic distinction between the visible and intelligible worlds shaped Christian theology for centuries. Through Augustine and later thinkers, Plato's influence dominated medieval philosophy, guiding reflections on God, soul, truth, and morality. Even when Aristotle was rediscovered in the 13th century and integrated by Thomas Aquinas, Platonic themes remained foundational, especially in mysticism, ethics, and metaphysics. During the Renaissance, Plato was rediscovered in a new way. Greek manuscripts carried west after the fall of Constantinople revealed the full corpus of his dialogues to scholars who had known him only indirectly. In Florence, Marsilio Ficino translated Plato into Latin and founded a new Platonic academy under the patronage of the Medici, where philosophers, poets, and artists gathered to explore beauty, love, and the soul. Renaissance humanism drew deeply from Plato's belief in the dignity of the soul and its capacity for self-transcendence. Artists like Michelangelo embraced the idea that physical beauty reflects an eternal form, seeing sculpture as the liberation of ideal form from stone. Poets reimagined Platonic love as a spiritual ascent. Political thinkers revived the dream of the ideal city, and in this rebirth, Plato became a source of inspiration rather than authority, shaping creativity rather than enforcing doctrine. As modern philosophy emerged, Plato remained an unavoidable presence. Rationalists like Descartes and Leibniz echoed his belief in innate ideas and the power of reason, while empiricists like Locke and Hume defined themselves in opposition to him, rejecting innate knowledge and transcendent forms. Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena mirrored Plato's separation of appearance and reality. Hegel's dialectic drew from the dialogical movement of Platonic thought. Even Nietzsche, who denounced Plato as life-denying, could not escape him, defining his philosophy through critique. In the 20th century, Alfred North Whitehead famously remarked that Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato, not as an exaggeration, but as an acknowledgement that Plato framed the questions that continue to define thought, questions about justice, reality, knowledge, and the good life. Plato's influence extended beyond philosophy into science, mathematics, psychology, and popular culture. Debates about whether mathematical truths are discovered or invented reflect a Platonic worldview. Freud's model of the psyche echoes Plato's tripartite soul. Modern films and novels retell the allegory of the cave in new forms, and discussions about technocracy, meritocracy, and expert rule replay the dilemma of the philosopher king. Plato's life began in the shadow of injustice and ended in quiet reflection, but his questions never found rest. They passed into institutions, religions, artworks, and scientific theories, shaping how generations understand the world and themselves. And in this enduring influence, Plato achieved something rare. Not the creation of a perfect system, but the creation of a tradition of questioning that refuses to fade. A reminder that philosophy is not about final answers, but about the courage to turn toward the light, even when the shadows are familiar, comforting, and dangerously persuasive.
By the time Plato's thought had been absorbed into Christianity, reshaped by Neoplatonism, and revived during the Renaissance, it had become something far larger than the work of a single man. It had become a lens through which the Western world understood reality itself. Yet Plato's influence did not end with art, theology, or metaphysics. It quietly structured the modern mind in ways that often go unnoticed, especially in mathematics and science, where the question of whether abstract entities exist independently of human thought remains deeply Platonic. When mathematicians speak of discovering a theorem rather than inventing it, they are implicitly affirming Plato's belief that mathematical truths inhabit an eternal realm accessible through reason, long before any human writes them down. Figures like Kurt Gödel openly embraced mathematical Platonism, believing that numbers and logical structures exist objectively, and that the human mind apprehends them rather than creates them. In physics, the mystery deepens further. Why should the universe be describable by mathematics at all? Why should equations written on paper correspond so precisely to the behavior of stars, atoms, and forces? Albert Einstein described this as the incomprehensible effectiveness of mathematics, a mystery that echoes Plato's conviction that the physical world is a reflection of intelligible structure. Some modern physicists, such as Max Tegmark, have gone so far as to propose that reality itself is a mathematical structure, a radical return to the Platonic idea that being and number are inseparable. Beyond science, Plato's influence reaches into psychology, where Sigmund Freud's division of the psyche into id, ego, and superego mirrors Plato's tripartite soul of appetite, reason, and spirit. Freud did not consciously imitate Plato, yet the resemblance reveals how deeply Platonic frameworks had penetrated Western thought, shaping even attempts to explain the mind in purely secular terms. In political philosophy, the tension between democracy and expertise remains unmistakably Platonic. Debates over technocracy, rule by experts, meritocracy, and the limits of popular decision-making replay Plato's concern that the many, guided by appetite and emotion, may be unfit to govern without wisdom. Critics of Plato, such as Karl Popper, condemned the Republic as a blueprint for totalitarianism, accusing Plato of sacrificing freedom for order and individuality for harmony. Yet even this critique confirms Plato's centrality. Modern political thought defines itself by wrestling with him, not by ignoring him. Popular culture continues to recycle Platonic imagery, often without realizing it. Films like The Matrix retell the allegory of the cave in digital form, where humanity mistakes simulation for reality,
and the hero's journey is one of awakening and return. Stories about virtual worlds, artificial intelligence, and simulated realities force us to ask once again what is real and how we can know it, questions Plato posed more than 2,000 years ago. Even our everyday language betrays his presence. When we speak of an ideal friendship, an ideal form, or a perfect version of something, we are invoking the Platonic distinction between imperfect instances and eternal standards. Plato's legacy is not confined to bookshelves or classrooms. It operates as part of the conceptual background of modern life, shaping assumptions about truth, value, and knowledge. Yet for all this influence, Plato himself would likely remain dissatisfied. He did not seek fame or intellectual dominance. He sought justice, wisdom, and care for the soul. And by his own standards, the world he helped shape remained deeply flawed. War, tyranny, and injustice persisted. Democracies rose and fell. Philosophers were still ignored or persecuted. Yet Plato's response to this failure was not despair, but persistence. Philosophy, he believed, was not a solution to history, but a companion through it, a way of resisting falsehood and moral collapse even when victory was impossible. In this sense, Plato's greatest achievement was not the theory of forms or the Republic or the Academy, but the insistence that human beings are capable of turning away from illusion, of questioning inherited beliefs, and of orienting their lives toward truth, however imperfectly. The young man who watched Socrates die learned that justice could be destroyed in the world, but not in thought, not in reason, not in the soul that refuses to surrender to lies. And that lesson continues to echo wherever people ask difficult questions, doubt easy answers, and choose examination over comfort. The long shadow of Plato stretches not because he solved philosophy, but because he taught the world how to live with unsolved questions, how to endure uncertainty without surrendering to ignorance, and how to pursue the good even when the city turns away. In that sense, Plato is not merely a figure of the past. He is a presence in every age that dares to ask, what is justice? What is real? And how should we live? To fully understand why Plato's shadow remains so long, we must return one last time to the question that began his journey and see how it survives in us. Plato never offered a simple definition of justice because he came to believe that justice is not a formula, but a condition, a harmony within the soul and within a community that must be constantly maintained, never permanently secured. In the Republic, justice appears as order, reason ruling spirit and appetite, each part doing its proper work. But Plato's own life taught him how fragile that order is. Athens killed Socrates legally, Syracuse murdered Dion politically, and both claimed necessity. From these failures, Plato learned that injustice often wears the mask of law, patriotism, or stability, and that the greatest danger is not chaos, but false certainty, the belief that power knows what it is doing. Plato's dialogues therefore resist closure. They circle questions rather than settling them, ending in aporia, a state of puzzlement meant not to frustrate, but to awaken. For Plato, philosophy was not about winning arguments, but about transforming the soul, turning it away from appearances toward what truly is. This turning is slow, painful, and never complete. Like the ascent from the cave, it blinds before it enlightens, and it demands sacrifice. Comfort, popularity, and even safety may be lost along the way. Socrates paid with his life, Plato paid with exile, failure, and disappointment, yet neither abandoned the pursuit, because to abandon it would be to accept the shadows as sufficient. Plato understood that most people do not want truth, they want reassurance, stories that justify their habits and power. This is why demagogues succeed and philosophers fail, and why philosophy must often exist at the margins, in schools, dialogues, and friendships, rather than thrones. The academy was Plato's final answer to politics, not an escape from the world, but a different way of engaging it, shaping individuals rather than masses, trusting that changed souls might someday produce better cities, even if he would never live to see them. This educational vision survives wherever learning is treated as liberation rather than training, wherever students are taught to question assumptions rather than memorize conclusions. Plato's insistence that education is the turning of the soul remains one of his most radical legacies. In an age obsessed with utility and speed, Plato reminds us that some truths cannot be rushed, measured, or monetized. They require patience, discipline, and silence, the courage to sit with uncertainty, the willingness to admit ignorance. These are not popular virtues, but they are necessary ones. The modern world, for all its technology, still faces the same dilemmas Plato confronted. Democracies manipulated by rhetoric, power divorced from wisdom, individuals torn between desire and reason, the question of whether reality is more than what appears on our screens. Plato does not resolve these problems for us, but he gives us a language to think about them, a framework to resist reduction and despair. His philosophy asks us to care for.
At the very end of Plato's long philosophical journey, what remains is not a system, but a stance toward existence itself, a way of standing in the world without surrendering to it. Plato understood something painfully clear from experience, that human life unfolds in tension between what is and what ought to be, between the visible world of power, desire, and opinion, and an invisible standard by which these things are judged. This tension never disappears. It cannot be legislated away or solved through progress, and every attempt to ignore it produces either cynicism or tyranny. Plato's insistence on a higher measure, whether called the good, the form of justice, or the truth itself, was not an escape from reality, but a refusal to let reality define its own standards. Without such a measure, power becomes self-justifying, and success becomes indistinguishable from goodness. The lesson Plato drew from Athens was not that democracy is always unjust, but that no political system is safe without philosophical self-examination. When citizens stop asking what justice is and settle for what is legal or popular, injustice becomes inevitable. This insight echoes through every age, from empires to modern states, wherever law replaces conscience and efficiency replaces wisdom. Plato's theory of forms, often criticized as abstract or otherworldly, was at its core a moral defense against relativism, a claim that some things are truly better than others, regardless of opinion or outcome. Justice is not whatever wins, beauty is not whatever pleases, truth is not whatever persuades. These standards may be difficult to know, but denying their existence leaves nothing but force and habit. Yet Plato was also honest about the cost of living by such standards. The philosopher will often be out of step with the city, misunderstood, mocked, or silenced. This is why Socrates' death was not an accident, but a warning. Philosophy threatens systems that depend on unexamined beliefs, and so it must often survive quietly, in dialogue, teaching, and reflection,
rather than proclamation. Plato's decision to write dialogues rather than treatises reflects this humility. He does not tell the reader what to think, he invites them into the struggle, forcing them to confront contradictions in their own beliefs, to feel confusion and resist premature certainty. This pedagogical method is itself ethical. It respects the reader's freedom while demanding responsibility. Plato believed that the soul grows not through instruction alone, but through inner conflict, through the discomfort of realizing one has been wrong. And this remains one of his most enduring insights. In a culture saturated with information but starved of wisdom, Plato's emphasis on slow thinking, questioning, and care for the soul feels almost subversive. Yet his philosophy does not demand withdrawal from life. It demands engagement on different terms, to participate without surrendering judgment, to act without confusing action with virtue, to seek truth without expecting applause. Plato did not believe the philosopher should rule because philosophers are superior beings, but because those least eager for power are often the most trustworthy. Ambition, he learned, corrupts even noble intentions, and wisdom flourishes where desire for domination is weakest. This is why the philosopher king is reluctant, ruling as duty rather than pleasure, a concept that remains provocative precisely because it challenges modern assumptions about leadership. Plato's later pessimism about politics was not despair, but realism. He no longer believed philosophy could save cities quickly, but he remained convinced it could save individuals and through them slowly influence communities. The academy embodied this faith, a space where truth could be pursued across generations without needing immediate results. In the end, Plato's life itself became his argument. He began as a young man shattered by injustice, sought answers in politics, failed, retreated into thought, returned to power, failed again, and finally accepted the limits of what philosophy can do in the world. Yet he never abandoned the belief that philosophy matters, that asking difficult questions is worth the cost, and that caring for the soul is the highest human task. Plato did not give us certainty, he gave us direction, not a map, but a compass, pointing beyond convenience and conformity towards something higher, something difficult and unfinished. And in that unfinished pursuit lies his true legacy, not a doctrine to inherit, but a responsibility to continue questioning, even when the answers are uncomfortable, even when the city prefers silence. Because, as Plato learned from Socrates and proved through his own life, the price of abandoning philosophy is far greater than the price of practicing it. It is the slow surrender of justice, truth, and meaning itself.
Plato's final and perhaps most enduring contribution lies not in any single doctrine, but in the attitude he cultivated toward truth itself, an attitude that resists both despair and dogmatism. He understood that human beings live suspended between ignorance and wisdom, capable of reason, yet constantly tempted by comfort, power, and illusion. And rather than promising salvation through philosophy, Plato offered discipline, patience, and responsibility. Philosophy does not make us superior, it makes us accountable for what we believe, how we act, and why we obey. This is why Plato distrusted rhetoric divorced from truth, because persuasion without understanding can mobilize crowds but cannot guide souls. Athens fell not because it lacked intelligence or culture, but because it allowed opinion to replace wisdom. And this danger never disappears, it merely changes form.
In every age, there are new caves, new shadows, new screens, new narratives that promise meaning without effort. Plato's work asks whether we are willing to question them, even when doing so isolates us, even when it costs comfort or belonging. The figure of the philosopher in Plato's dialogues is not heroic in the usual sense. He is awkward, poor, mocked, and often ineffective. Yet he alone is free, free from the need to impress, free from fear of death, free from the tyranny of appetite. This freedom is not political, but internal, and Plato came to believe it was the only freedom that could not be taken away, even by exile, slavery, or execution. This is why Socrates remains at the center of Plato's thought long after his death. Socrates represents a life aligned with reason, regardless of outcome, a life that refuses to trade truth for survival. Plato did not idealize this path. He knew its cost, but he believed the cost of abandoning it was greater. A society that kills its questioners slowly loses the ability to correct itself, and a soul that avoids self-examination gradually becomes hollow. Plato's philosophy, therefore, remains uncomfortable. It offers no shortcuts, no guarantees, no final harmony in history. Only the claim that caring for the soul is the highest human responsibility, higher than success, higher than loyalty, even higher than survival. This claim is unsettling because it cannot be outsourced to institutions or leaders. It rests with each individual. Every time we choose whether to examine our beliefs or repeat them, whether to seek understanding or settle for approval, whether to live deliberately or drift, we reenact Plato's question. The academy may have closed, empires may have fallen, religions may have risen and transformed his ideas, but the core challenge remains unchanged. Will we live among shadows, content with appearances, or will we risk the ascent toward truth, knowing it offers no shelter from the world's hostility? Plato does not command, he invites. He leaves the dialogue open, unfinished, because philosophy, as he understood it, is not something to complete, but something to continue. And as long as that continuation is possible, as long as questioning survives, Plato's work is not past, it is present, waiting not to be agreed with, but to be taken seriously. In the end, Plato's legacy rests on a quiet but radical demand that human beings must take responsibility for the shape of their inner lives, not merely for their actions or opinions, but for the orientation of their souls. He believed that injustice begins long before laws are broken or violence occurs. It begins when reason surrenders its authority to desire, when convenience replaces truth, and when questioning is treated as threat rather than necessity. This is why Plato never separated ethics from metaphysics or politics from education. How we understand reality determines how we live within it. If the world is nothing but appearances and power, then manipulation becomes wisdom, and success becomes virtue. But if reality includes standards beyond opinion, justice, beauty, goodness, then life becomes a task of alignment rather than acquisition. Plato's insistence on this alignment explains both his hope and his disappointment. He hoped that education could turn souls toward the good, yet he learned that most people resist such turning, preferring certainty to truth and belonging to understanding. And so Plato adjusted his expectations without abandoning his principles. Philosophy would not save cities quickly, but it could preserve the possibility of justice across time. This preservation happens not through domination, but through dialogue, teaching, and example, through small communities of inquiry that resist the erosion of meaning. The Academy was one such community, but every genuine conversation that refuses easy answers becomes another. Plato's dialogues endure because they do not dictate conclusions, they provoke participation, they unsettle complacency, and force readers to confront their own assumptions. Even now, they ask whether we truly know what we claim to value, whether our political loyalties align with justice, whether our desires serve the good or merely distract from it. Plato's life teaches that philosophy does not guarantee happiness, safety, or success, but it offers something rarer, coherence, a life that makes sense to itself even when the world does not. This coherence was what Socrates embodied and what Plato spent his life trying to understand and preserve. And it is why Plato remains relevant in every age of crisis. Whenever societies struggle with truth and power, whenever individuals feel torn between integrity and advantage, Plato's voice returns, not as an answer, but as a question, asking whether we are willing to live examined lives in an unexamined world, and whether we believe that justice, though fragile, is still worth seeking, even when it offers no reward beyond the preservation of the soul itself. And so, the journey that began with a single injustice does not truly end. It opens outward into every generation that inherits Plato's questions, because Plato ultimately understood that philosophy is not a possession passed down intact, but a burden each age must carry for itself. The danger he saw in Athens was not unique to democracy or to ancient Greece. It was the universal danger of forgetting why truth matters. When societies value efficiency over wisdom, loyalty over justice, and certainty over understanding, they recreate the conditions that condemned Socrates in new forms. Plato's dialogues function as warnings as much as guides, reminders that intelligence without virtue becomes manipulation, that power without reflection becomes tyranny, and knowledge pursued without care for the soul becomes empty. This is why Plato resisted writing final doctrines, why he preferred dialogue to declaration, because fixed answers invite complacency, while questions demand vigilance. The reader of Plato is never allowed to rest. Every apparent conclusion is tested, reversed, or left unresolved, forcing the reader into the work of philosophy themselves. And this labor is precisely the point. Plato believed that truth cannot be handed down like law. It must be rediscovered internally through struggle, confusion, and insight. The allegory of the cave does not end with enlightenment, it ends with responsibility. The philosopher must return to the cave, knowing he will be misunderstood, resisted, or even attacked, yet he refuses to abandon others to illusion. This ethical core of Plato's thought, knowledge creates obligation, understanding binds us to care, and wisdom without compassion is incomplete. Plato's own life mirrors this pattern. He withdrew from politics, but never from responsibility, founding the Academy not as a refuge from the world, but as preparation for engaging it more honestly. Even when direct reform proved impossible, he invested in future minds, trusting that philosophy works slowly, often invisibly, shaping sensibilities before shaping systems. This long view is one difficult lesson for the modern world, which demands immediate results and visible success. Plato asks whether we are willing to work for outcomes we may never see, to plant seeds whose growth we will not witness, to care for justice not because it wins, but because it is right. This ethical patience stands in sharp contrast to both cynicism and fanaticism. Plato rejects the belief that nothing matters and the belief that everything can be fixed at once. He occupies the difficult middle ground of commitment without illusion.
If Plato could speak to the modern world, he would not recognize our machines, our cities, or our speed.
but he would recognize our confusion, our hunger for certainty, our fear of silence, and our attraction to comforting illusions. The shadows on the wall have changed shape, but not function. Today they glow from screens, circulate through slogans and algorithms, and reward attention rather than understanding. Yet the question Plato asked remains unchanged. Are we seeing reality or only its reflections? And are we willing to endure the discomfort of turning toward truth? Plato never promised that philosophy would make life easier. He promised it would make life clearer. And clarity is often painful. It requires letting go of identities built on opinion, success measured by approval, and beliefs inherited rather than examined. This is why philosophy has always been dangerous. It does not attack governments first. It destabilizes certainties, and from that destabilization, everything else follows. Plato knew that a society can tolerate injustice more easily than uncertainty, because injustice can be justified, but uncertainty demands change. This is why his dialogues continue to unsettle readers. They do not flatter, they expose. They ask whether we truly understand what we claim to value, whether our ideas of justice, freedom, and happiness can survive scrutiny. Plato's greatest gift was not answers, but courage. The courage to ask questions, even when the answers threaten comfort and belonging. And this courage is as necessary now as it was in ancient Athens, because every age produces its own myths that claim inevitability, its own systems that insist there is no alternative. Plato reminds us that there is always an alternative: thinking, slow, disciplined, honest thinking, care for the soul in a culture that profits from distraction, responsibility in a world that rewards impulse, and truth in a landscape saturated with persuasion. The academy may have vanished physically, but it exists wherever dialogue replaces shouting, wherever education aims at understanding rather than obedience, and wherever individuals refuse to accept that the world as it is defines what it ought to be. Plato's life did not end with triumph. It ended with continuity, a tradition of questioning passed forward, unfinished by design, because philosophy, as he understood it, is not something to conclude, but something to practice again and again in every generation. And as long as human beings continue to ask what is just, what is real, and what is worth living for, Plato's voice will remain present, not commanding, not consoling, but quietly insisting that the examined life, however difficult, is the only life worthy of a thinking soul. And so Plato's story closes not with certainty, but with responsibility, a responsibility he places gently yet firmly on every thinking mind. He shows that philosophy is not an escape from history, but a response to it, a refusal to let violence, popularity, or success become the final judges of truth. Plato learned early that a society can be educated, wealthy, and powerful, and still commit profound injustice. And from this he drew a lesson that remains unsettling. Intelligence without wisdom is not progress, it is danger. This is why he insisted that the deepest work of philosophy happens before politics, before action, in the ordering of the soul itself. A disordered soul produces disordered cities, no matter how advanced their laws or technologies. And an ordered soul can preserve justice even in unjust circumstances. This belief gave Plato both strength and restraint. strength to continue questioning after repeated failures, and restraint to accept that philosophy cannot control outcomes, only intentions. The modern world often demands solutions, systems, guarantees. Plato offers none of these. Instead, he offers a practice, attention, dialogue, self-examination, the slow cultivation of judgment. These are not dramatic, they do not trend, but they endure. Plato understood that what lasts is not what conquers quickly, but what teaches patiently. This is why his influence survived the fall of Athens, the rise of empires, the spread of religions, and the revolutions of science, because it did not depend on authority, it depended on participation. Anyone willing to ask why and refuse easy answers could enter the dialogue, regardless of time or place. In this sense, Plato never truly belonged to ancient Greece alone. He belongs to every moment where thinking resists surrender, where individuals sense that something essential is missing beneath comfort and noise, and dare to look for it. The long shadow of Plato is not cast by power or certainty, but by endurance, the endurance of questions that refuse to die. And as long as human beings continue to feel that tension between what is and what ought to be, Plato's work remains unfinished, waiting not for agreement, but for courage, the courage to turn away from shadows and accept the lifelong task of seeking the good, knowing that the search itself, not its completion, is what gives a human life its deepest meaning. Plato's ultimate challenge to us is subtle but demanding. He asks whether we are willing to live without final guarantees, to act justly without certainty of reward, and to pursue truth even when it offers no protection from loss. His philosophy rejects both naive optimism and bitter cynicism. Instead, it occupies a narrow path between them, one that accepts human limitations without surrendering to meaninglessness. Plato understood that the desire for absolute certainty often drives people toward dogma, ideology, or blind loyalty, because uncertainty is frightening. It exposes vulnerability. Yet he also knew that rejecting truth because it is difficult leaves only power and impulse to govern human life. The examined life, then, is not comfortable. It is courageous. It requires standing in tension, knowing that our knowledge is incomplete, yet still acting as if justice matters. Plato's dialogues train this courage. They do not let the reader hide behind slogans or borrowed opinions. They force confrontation with ambiguity, contradiction, and ignorance. And through this confrontation, something essential is formed: judgment, the capacity to weigh, discern, and choose responsibly. Plato believed this capacity mattered more than any single belief, because beliefs can change, but judgment determines how change is navigated. This is why his philosophy remains relevant even when his conclusions are rejected. One can disagree with the theory of forms, with philosopher kings, or with reincarnation, and still be profoundly shaped by Plato's way of thinking. The insistence on definition, the refusal to accept appearance as reality, the belief that ethics, politics, and metaphysics are inseparable, and the conviction that education is fundamentally moral, shaping not just skills, but souls. Plato's legacy survives wherever thinking is treated as a discipline rather than entertainment, wherever disagreement deepens understanding rather than ending conversation, and wherever truth is pursued as something that demands personal transformation, not just intellectual assent. This is why Plato continues to unsettle modern readers. He does not allow us to outsource responsibility to systems, experts, or traditions. He returns it to the individual soul, asking whether we are ruled by reason or by appetite, whether we seek understanding or merely confirmation, and whether we are willing to pay the price of clarity in a world that rewards noise. Plato's life did not resolve the conflict between philosophy and power, but it revealed what is at stake in that conflict, the soul's freedom. And in preserving that freedom through questioning, teaching, and dialogue, Plato ensured that even when cities fail, something essential can endure, the possibility that human beings might still choose to live deliberately, guided not by shadows, but by the difficult and
As Plato's physical strength slowly declined, his intellectual intensity remained undiminished. His later works reveal a mind still wrestling with first principles, questioning not only the world, but his own earlier conclusions. One of the most striking examples appears in the dialogue Parmenides, where Plato subjects the theory of forms to ruthless examination, allowing a younger Socrates to be dismantled by the elder philosopher Parmenides. Arguments such as the famous third man problem expose logical tensions within the theory, suggesting infinite regress and unresolved participation. Plato offers no final solution, and this silence is deliberate. It shows a thinker unwilling to protect his ideas from criticism, even when those ideas form the core of his life's work. Philosophy for Plato was never about defending doctrines, but about sustaining inquiry. This intellectual humility marks his late period, where certainty gives way to precision and questioning becomes more rigorous rather than less. At the same time, Plato continued to explore cosmology and order in the dialogue Timaeus, presenting the universe as a rational organism shaped by a divine craftsman, the demiurge, who imposes mathematical structure upon chaos by looking to eternal forms. Yet even here, Plato describes his account as a likely story rather than absolute truth, acknowledging the limits of human knowledge. This balance between metaphysical ambition and epistemic restraint defines his mature philosophy. He no longer seeks final answers, but coherent orientation, a way for the soul to align itself with reason in a world that remains partly unknowable. These late works reveal a philosopher who had learned from failure without surrendering to skepticism, refining his vision while accepting uncertainty, and demonstrating that true wisdom lies not in the possession of truth, but in the disciplined pursuit of it. During these final decades, the Academy itself became a living experiment in Plato's mature philosophy, no longer centered on a single voice, but on sustained dialogue across generations. Students debated mathematics, metaphysics, ethics, and politics under Plato's guidance, yet were encouraged to challenge even their teachers' most fundamental assumptions. This openness is best embodied in the presence of Aristotle, whose growing disagreements with Plato signaled not decline, but intellectual vitality. Plato understood that philosophy could not survive as orthodoxy. It required disagreement to remain alive, and in allowing such challenges, he ensured that his thought would evolve rather than fossilize. At the same time, Plato increasingly emphasized oral teaching over writing, believing that the highest truths could not be captured fully in texts. Aristotle later reported that Plato taught unwritten doctrines concerning ultimate principles such as unity and multiplicity, suggesting that reality itself arises from the interaction of the one and the indefinite dyad. These teachings were reserved for advanced students, not as secrets, but as protections. Plato feared profound ideas misunderstood could mislead rather than enlighten.
This caution reflects his deep awareness of philosophy's power and its danger. As his health declined, Plato's daily presence at the academy became less frequent, yet his influence remained constant, shaping discussions even in absence. He was no longer the restless reformer seeking to change cities, but the elder philosopher cultivating continuity, ensuring that the love of truth would survive him. This transition from founder to guardian marked the completion of his life's work. Philosophy had become larger than the man who began it, and in accepting this, Plato achieved a rare form of success, not victory, but endurance. As Plato entered the very last phase of his life, his attention turned quietly but firmly toward legacy. Not legacy in the sense of fame, but in the survival of philosophical seriousness after his death. He understood that ideas are fragile when detached from disciplined communities, and that without institutions devoted to truth, philosophy dissolves into rhetoric or ideology. The academy therefore became his final argument, a living structure designed to outlast his founder, where questioning would remain central and authority would never replace reason. Plato accepted that he would not see the long-term results of this effort, yet this acceptance reflected his deepest conviction that philosophy works across generations rather than moments, shaping minds slowly, often invisibly. As his body weakened, he withdrew further from public life, but his presence continued to shape the tone of inquiry around him. Students remembered not only his arguments, but his restraint, his refusal to force conclusions, and his insistence that understanding must be earned rather than transmitted. Unlike Socrates, whose life ended in public confrontation, Plato's final years passed in relative quiet, yet this quiet was not withdrawal, but completion. The philosopher who once tried to confront power directly had learned to invest in continuity instead of control, trusting that a tradition of thinking once rooted could survive political collapse, cultural change, and even persecution. This trust proved justified because the academy did not merely preserve Plato's ideas, it preserved his method, dialogue, patience, and intellectual courage. And in doing so, it ensured that philosophy would not end with him, but would remain an open task, passed forward to minds yet unborn, still capable of asking the same questions that first shattered a young man's faith in his city and pushed him toward a lifetime of thought. Plato's death came quietly, without drama or spectacle, a stark contrast to the violent end that had defined the beginning of his philosophical journey. Ancient sources differ on the details. Some say he died peacefully in his sleep, others that he passed away during a wedding feast surrounded by music and celebration. Yet all agree on the tone of his passing, calm, natural, and complete. He was around 80 years old, an extraordinary age for the ancient world, and he left behind not a political movement or a closed doctrine, but a living school and a body of work designed to provoke thought rather than command belief. Leadership of the academy passed to his nephew Speusippus, not to Aristotle, a decision shaped by circumstance, politics, and philosophical difference. Aristotle soon left Athens and would later found his own school, the Lyceum, setting the stage for a dialogue between Platonic and Aristotelian traditions that would shape Western thought for centuries. Plato's burial place remains uncertain. Some claimed he was laid to rest within the academy grounds, others that he was buried in the Ceramicus, among Athens' honored dead. Yet the location matters less than what endured. The academy continued for nearly 1,000 years, surviving empires, religious transformation, and cultural collapse, until it was finally closed by imperial decree in 529 AD, long after Plato's ideas had escaped any single institution. His dialogues spread across the Mediterranean, copied, translated, and debated, entering Roman thought, Christian theology, Islamic philosophy, and Renaissance humanism. Plato did not live to see this influence, but his life was shaped by the belief that truth does not depend on recognition, only on fidelity. And in dying without fear or bitterness, he embodied the very harmony of soul he had spent a lifetime describing. The philosopher who began by witnessing injustice ended by proving that a life devoted to reason could still reach completion, even in a world that rarely rewards it. After Plato's death, his influence did not fade, it multiplied. The Academy continued as a center of learning for centuries, adapting to new intellectual climates while preserving the spirit of inquiry he had established. Early successors emphasized different aspects of his thought, some focusing on mathematics and metaphysics, others on ethics and logic, yet all treated philosophy as a disciplined way of life rather than a collection of opinions. Over time, Plato's ideas flowed beyond Athens, entering Roman culture through thinkers like Cicero, who admired Plato not only as a philosopher, but as a moral guide, presenting him as a model of the examined life suited to statesmen and citizens alike. Later, in late antiquity, Plato's legacy was transformed through Neoplatonism, where philosophers such as Plotinus reinterpreted his ideas in a more mystical direction, describing reality as an emanation from a single transcendent source, the One, and presenting philosophy as the soul's ascent